Thank you all for coming to our first big Kaleidoscope here at First United Methodist Church of Arlington Heights. And I want to welcome you here on behalf of United Women of Faith and Adult Faith Formation Committee. Those are the two who are sponsoring today's program with Michelle Duster, the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, and author of Ida B. the Queen. For those of you who haven't seen the book, there's the book. It's wonderful. And I'm sure by the end of this hour, you're going to walk away knowing much more about this important woman who made a difference for so many. And for those of you who are watching at home, you can feel free to text questions to Lynn Michaels if you have Lynn's phone number, and ask questions that way. And for those of you watching at home, well, I guess you could be watching this at any time, so hopefully you will enjoy it as well. A little bit about our guest. Michelle Duster has worked for over 30 years in various mediums to highlight the positive contributions of women and African Americans to the United States. She's written articles and books, worked on monuments, markers, murals, films, concert, and film festivals, all to tell stories that are frequently omitted, skewed, or marginalized. She is determined to help current and future generations be exposed and inspired by a more inclusive and truthful representation, which goes along with our sermon today about inclusivity. Duster believes that what we've lost can be restored through Duster's dedicated work, her platform, and her civic involvement. Ida B. Wells is getting the recognition she finally deserves. There are books about her, buildings, streets, parks, schools, and museums named after her, and awards that commemorate her selfless, purpose-driven work. Duster wrote, "My great-grandmother's life was not easy. She endured death threats, she lost friends to lynching, she lost parents through disease, she lost her teaching job, and when she spoke up about inequality. She lost her printing press when she spoke up about injustice. But through it all, she stayed focused on truth-telling. She believed that her voice was important and her story needed to be heard." I'm going to start with the first question, and then after that, we're going to have our roving microphones. Lynn will have one, and Allison will have the other. Okay, so here's our first question. How did you decide what to include or omit in the book? And how is your book different from the other biographies of Ida B. Wells? Kind of a big one.
Well, first, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you all reading the book and being here to interact with me. I don't know how many of you all have written a book before, but it's kind of like you're just by yourself with you and your computer and the editor at some point, and so you're just kind of like in your own bubble. So to interact with people who've actually read the book is, I really appreciate this opportunity. When it came to what to include and what not to include, it was overwhelming. I mean, I was approached about writing the book, and I honestly felt like I didn't know where to start. Because Ida's life is very expansive, not only what she did during her lifetime, but the time period that she lived in, spanning from the Civil War to the Great Depression, was a very pivotal part of our country's history. I actually read all of the biographies that have been written about her, and her autobiography, and all of her writing. I added up the page numbers, and I think it was around 4,000 pages of reading. Wow. That I did in order to see what already was out in the world, and what kind of angle other people had taken, so that I could come up with something different. And so I had my ideas on what I thought other books did not focus on as much as. Like, all of them focused mostly on what she did as a young woman. And so I kind of wanted to steer things a little bit to some of her lesser known work. But from the time that I started the book until it was published, it went through a whole lot of changes.
Yeah.
For anybody who's ever worked with an editor, the final product is very rarely similar to the first draft. So it went through a whole lot of changes. But one of the things that I really was fascinated about, and I argued down to start the book, was her being investigated by the FBI. She sort of glossed over it a little bit in her book. And she actually glossed over quite a few things. And that's the other thing about autobiographies, is that, you know, people pick and choose what they want to tell about their own life, or sometimes things that we, looking back on, think is a big deal. For them, it was not a big deal. So it's kind of interesting having this distance from her life to, for me, 100 years later, to think, well, why didn't she, you know, talk about this a little bit more? So I was just super fascinated by the whole FBI situation, and so I wanted to start with that, and I really try to find as much information as I could about that particular incident. And so I wanted to include that in the book. There are some things that I wanted to expound on a little bit more, but then the editor and I kind of went to blows. And so there are some things that I really was hoping could stay in the book, and they were not included in as much detail as I originally wanted. So there's a lot that's not in the book. You know, I mean, Paula Giddings wrote an 800-page book on Ida, and that still doesn't have everything in it. So it's almost impossible to include everything.
But you also included other inspirational figures, and so, which actually made it even more relevant, I think, as people would read it. So were there some people that you wanted to include, apart from stories of your grandmother, that maybe your editor didn't want to have in the book, or?
Well, I mean, one of the goals that we had, when I say we, I mean me, the editor, the publisher, was to make her story contemporary. And so there were a lot of ideas that swirled around on how to do that. And it was my idea to connect the work that Ida did to people who are more current, because I wanted, especially younger people, meaning like maybe high school and under, to feel like, oh, at least I've heard of this person before. They might have heard of Colin Kaepernick, and they might have heard of Black Lives Matter. And so I thought that would draw younger people into realizing that what Ida did has contemporary relevancy. And then they could sort of tie the past to the present.
So what would you say was your focused audience that you were writing for?
It was really targeted towards younger people. I mean, when I had it in my head, okay, I teach at Columbia College, and so I deal with mostly 18 to 22-year-olds, although there's a few that are a little older. But still, I mean, you know, the ones that are sophomores, I teach a class that has prerequisites, so I mostly deal with sophomore through seniors. But still, most of them are only 1 year out of high school. And so I had my student population in mind when I was constructing and writing and organizing the book, of like, what would that age group be able to relate to? And so that's who I had in my head, you know, the young adults who are just getting out of their parents' house and starting to pay their own bills and starting to think about what kind of job they want to have, and like where, and especially young women, like who they are, like how they're forming their own identity. And so I wanted to humanize Ida, and I wanted to include some of her struggles and some of her insecurities and some of her love for fashion and things like that, because I thought, well, younger women will relate to that kind of trying to figure out who you are as a woman.
Okay. Okay, now we're going to turn it over to our roving microphones.
I have someone right here, and everybody loved the clothes horse story. So
Yes,
The what story?
the clothes horse.
Oh, okay.
The love of fashion.
Yeah.
All right. So first, I want to just say thank you for writing the book. If you need someone to do a commercial for the book, come see me. I love everything about this book. Aesthetically, the paper is smooth, the cover, the colors, the artwork. It's a gorgeous book, first of all. So even holding it and reading, it's like a pleasurable experience. I love the title, Ida B. the Queen. She is the queen. I knew some things about her beforehand, but how you laid out her story and the things I learned, I'm in awe of her bravery and her courage. So, and she's such a role model is not even a word, that she's way beyond that. So thank you. And I've been in a small group that's been discussing your book and wishing you were with us. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is, when you think about your life, you talked about it a little bit. What was it like being the great-granddaughter of such an amazing person, such courage, such conviction, and how did it change for you over your life? When you were young, whether a child, adolescent, young adult, and then through your adulthood and now, how do you see being the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Influencing you? Great-great-granddaughter?
One great.
One great. One great. So how do you see it influencing you?
That's a very interesting question. I actually, when I was coming here, I was having a conversation with my brother about, for me, some of the, it's hard to say it's a challenge because then it sounds ungrateful, but for me, and I can only speak for myself, I can't even speak for my brothers who are equally related to Ida or any of my cousins. I'm one of 15 grandchildren of my grandmother, who was Ida's youngest daughter, and then there were 5 others grandchildren from her son. So there were a total of 20 great-grandchildren. Now they're 17. And so out of all of those people, at this point, I think I am the most well-known out of my generation. I am doing, my brother does a lot of work around Ida's legacy. He does a lot of speaking, but I'm the only one who's published a book, and I'm the only one I'm a writer, and that was my profession before I started this book. And I also went to film school and worked in a lot of the communication fields. I mean, that was just what I liked to do. And so when I was growing up, I knew who Ida was. I knew that I was related to her. Her youngest daughter, Alfreda, was my grandmother. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, and so I didn't grow up probably the way most people's families are, where you just live your life and then people come up in conversation. And so it was sprinkled throughout my life of, what my great-grandmother did. But when I was growing up, my grandmother, okay, so this is the thing. My grandmother being the daughter of Ida B. Wells, I think for her, and I've tried to think about it as I've gotten older, I think for her, sometimes it wasn't that easy because you're the daughter of somebody who's so well known. Not only that, but there was danger. There were death threats, there were mysterious fires, there were things that happened during my grandmother's life that I think influenced her to decide that she wanted to be a private person. I mean, being a public person there are pros and cons. And I think my grandmother decided, because she decided she was just gonna kind of, live her life under the radar, she was very encouraging of me and all of my cousins and my brothers to really focus on having our own identity, having our own accomplishments, having our own achievements, and not sort of ride off of being related to somebody. I mean, she would tell us, like, you can't make a living by somebody else's accomplishments. Like, you have to have your own. And so I feel like I was raised to not focus on who Ida was, but like who is Michelle, and to be the best Michelle I can be, and not be the best, descendant of somebody who I never met. But I think because I've chosen the career path that I have, and I've followed my own interests and the things that have meaning to me, and because I'm female, I think a lot of people put things on me that they want to see, that it might not necessarily be who I am. So for me, it can be a little bit of a tension between what people think I am and what I am, and I'm still trying to kind of grapple with how to handle all of that, because it's, I think everybody wants to have their own identity. I think so. I think that's sort of a human need, to be seen as an individual. And sometimes that's a challenge when you have a legacy that people admire, and so they see you as an extension of your legacy versus you as an individual person.
Good answer. Okay, next. Okay, Tom has a question.
Hi, thanks again for writing the book. I agree that it's a beautiful book. I really enjoyed reading it. A lot of times when I'm in a book group, you get to the book and you're like, it feels like a chore to catch up and read the next part for this, but I didn't feel like that way at all. I'm an artist, so I actually have two questions. My first one is about the photographs as opposed to the pictures. I was kind of curious as to why you decided in some to use photographs and others you just use graphic images, recreations of them. I don't know how involved you are in that. And then my second question is, I really appreciated just some of the small little facts that you just threw out, and it just made me realize how much more depth you have. You could probably write multiple books based on the knowledge you accumulated researching this book. Like one instance was, you mentioned Rosa Parks being a part of one of Ida B.'s groups. And I was like, oh, all I was ever taught in school was like one day Rosa B. Parks decided to stand in the bus. And I had no idea until I just read that one little line that she was also involved, before she did that in the bus. And so one of the things I picked up reading it, that Ida seemed to switch a lot of times, like the organizations she was running or was as a part of, so I was just wondering if you have a little bit more information on why she decided to drop some of them, or why she kept switching to different organizations she was heavily involved in.
Okay, so the first question was about illustrations versus photographs. That was a decision that was pretty much made by the editor. She decided that, because I did have photos of everything, and she and whoever, the team, made a decision that having it all photos would make it look like a magazine. And so she was like, maybe we can mix it up a little bit and have, certain people illustrate it, so it would make it a little bit more unique, as far as the book versus any photos that you can go to. At this point, you can go on Google Images and find. So that was the decision, was to kind of, create a more uniqueness to this book. As far as, I mean, yes, there's a whole lot that is not in the book. I tried to, when I introduced other people and tried to connect them to Ida's story, either directly or indirectly, as far as like continuing on with the work that she did, or somehow being interrelated to the organizations that she was part of. Again, it was just kind of sprinkling, because every single one of the people that I mentioned in the book could have a whole book about them. In fact, some of them do, or multiple books about them. So, yes, I mentioned Rosa Parks, and I mean, a lot of people don't realize that she was involved in the case where, I'm forgetting the woman off the top of my head, the lady who, let me see
Go
if I
for
can-
it.
I'm just literally having a block. But the woman who was raped, Reese Taylor, Rosa Parks was involved in defending Reese Taylor, and Rosa was an activist by trade, and so people didn't even know that about her. They just always think of her as, you know, the woman the seamstress who was tired and sat on the bus. And now, what's happening today in 2023 is that some books are even being rewritten to not even explain why she was required to sit in the back of the bus. I mean, it's like this mystery. And why some man, wanted her to get up, and it's just crazy, like the really skewing of history that's going on now. So in addition to people, I guess now not even knowing why she had to sit it was law that she had to sit on the back of the bus. Most people don't know about her activism before that incident, and they really don't know about Claudette Colvin, who actually was a teenager. I don't know if do you all know about Claudette Colvin?
Why don't you tell us?
She's starting to get more attention now, 50, 60 years later, but Claudette Colvin was a teenager. I think she was around 15 years old. And she is the first person in Montgomery who refused to move her seat. And so she was before Rosa Parks. And Rosa, was in her 40s at that time, and Claudette was a teenager. And there was kind of a decision made by and people don't remember that Rosa Parks worked for the NAACP. She had an entire organization behind her. And so she, got on the bus and refused to move, and she knew that she had a whole institution behind her. And there was kind of a decision made in Montgomery to have Rosa sort of be the face of the civil rights movement instead of Claudette, because Claudette was a teenager and she was pregnant. Mm-hmm. So people were like, that can't be the look, of the movement. And so she was kind of pushed aside in deference to Rosa, who sort of fit the look. I mean, she was, considered, an older, more mature woman. She was, she was not a threatening sort of force as far as she was a seamstress. And just think of the whole sort of narrative that was, sort of put around her. And so now Claudette there are a few books about her that have been written now, and she's still alive. She is starting to get a little bit more attention. I think I did mention Claudette, and I think I remember that I mentioned her in the book, but she was very much skimmed over in that history.
Okay, another question. Lynn's going for, yes.
Can you tell me the question, or do you want the microphone? Oh, okay. So Liz's question is, were you ever able to hear recordings or anything from Ida B. Wells? Is there any audio or visual?
No.
Nothing like that.
Which there were a number of photographs I watched. For those of you who don't know, if you go to YouTube, Chicago Stories, just search under Ida B. Wells, and it was a really good documentary that Krista and I watched last night. But there were so many photos of her, and I thought at that time period, people didn't have that many photos. I thought it was intriguing, but she wasn't.
They're not, okay, so they probably put every photo that exists of her in the movie. Because, obviously compared to today, where people
Right.
have thousands of photos a year. I just downloaded some of my photos. I think I had like 1,400 photos.
Yes.
It's ridiculous, like how many pictures we take today. So compare it to today, it's
Right.
not that many. And maybe they're about 20.
It seemed
photos of her.
it seemed much more, but it was very expensive back then. That's why I.
Yeah, and then some people say like, oh, I don't understand why people didn't smile, and like, oh, they looked mean, and like, okay, so you don't know anything about photography. Yeah. Because, back in the day, when photographs were sort of first invented, photography was first invented, people had to sit still for a long period. Because the aperture, had to stay open for a very long time. And so it wasn't like anybody's just snapping, selfies and just click, and so how long can you sit like smiling for like an hour? Like nobody does that, so almost all the pictures from that time period, people are not smiling. They had to sit still. I have to tell people, I told you I teach students, they don't know about, they just, everything's a cell phone. I'm like, no, there was such a thing as a camera that was not part of a phone. And, so the technology, people need to really understand maybe a little bit more how technology has changed over time.
Okay. Another question?
Yeah, I loved your book. I'm part of the group
Thank
that
you.
some of these people are speaking up for because it was just, the graphics and the content were just matched beautifully. And I thought that whoever did the graphics of Shirley Chisholm nailed it. And she retired to my town of Williamsville, New York. And so even in her retirement years, she was super involved. So I'm grateful that you include Shirley because very few people know she was the first black woman to run for president of the United States of America. It's pretty darn good. I also wanted to say that our group is talking about, after we read the book, we always have this thing about what can we do about whatever we're reading about. And one of the things we thought about was the fact that the anti-lynching bill passed the Senate, has not passed the House because the name of Emmett Till was added to the bill, which is a travesty. So do you have any suggestions on how we can help move that along?
Actually, it was passed last year, March 29th, 2022. If you look at my website, mldrights.com, I actually got a chance to be there when President Biden signed the bill into law. Yeah. As of the book, it hadn't been passed, but the book was published in 2021. So only a year later, it actually did pass, and that was an amazing experience. I got a chance to not only be there, but I spoke. So if you look at my website, you'll see my little speech at the White House. So that was pretty cool. Well, not very pretty cool. It was very cool. Yeah.
One other thing, because I had read the article about the statue of Ida B. Wells in Memphis in the Chicago Tribune. Mm-hmm. And you finished a book before that happened. So I was there in May of 2022. And I also, and it's a wonderful thing. Now, the taxi driver that took me there, I had a little bit of free time. I was on a Mississippi River cruise. You get so many hours, you get off the boat. And so I said to the taxi driver, I want to go to the Ida B. Wells statue. He says, what's that? Now, this is a black man. Now, maybe he didn't live there very long. But anyway, on the ride, I Googled where it was. On the ride, I filled him in all about her. So I said, now you have to pay it forward, and you have to tell about her to other people in your taxi. But I do have the article in the Memphis newspaper about that day. If you'll just let me read this. I think it's wonderful. July 16th, which is Ida B. Wells' birthday, 2021. About 200 community members gathered to celebrate the unveiling of the Ida B. Wells statue in downtown Memphis, a life-size statue honoring the pioneering journalist, educator, and civil rights advocate, now stands at Beale and 4th Streets, adjacent to the original office of Wells' The Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. The unveiling culminated a full week of festivities celebrating Wells' life and legacy in Memphis. Before the unveiling, a parade celebrating Wells' 159th birthday. She was born on July 16, 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Marched down Beale from Main to 4th. Carriages, corvettes, and musicians with clashing cymbals made their way along the parade route to the site of the ceremony. Whoops, problem with the phone here. As the bronze statue was unveiled, it was met with cheers, applause, and drumming. The southeast corner of the intersection features more than just the statue. There is a metal tree, the tree of strange fruit, in memory of Wells' 3 friends who were lynched in 1892 and inspired her to continue documenting lynchings. Also, there are pavilions that feature each of the roles, journalist, suffragist, and entrepreneur, Wells took on during her time in Memphis. Michelle Dunster, her great-granddaughter, it says here great-great, that's why I got confused. Her great-granddaughter was then featured speaker. She said, "Some people don't want our stories, our realities, our perspectives to be told, heard, or acknowledged. But between all of us present today in the spirit of Ida B. Wells, we will not be silenced. We will not be marginalized. We will not allow our truths, our stories, our experiences to be minimized or erased. What you have created here with this Ida B. Wells statue and Ida B. Wells Plaza is of national significance and a source of pride for our members and the country."
Yay to me.
That reminds me, though, that at one time, one of the projects in Chicago was named after your great-grandmother. Mm-hmm. And then they were torn down, and we now have the road, the Ida B. Wells. But I think in the book, you comment that the projects were kind of the antithesis. It was kind of going against the whole idea that she had of inclusivity and...
Well, when the housing community was created and it opened in 1941, it was only 10 years after she died. And she lived, the house that she and her husband Ferdinand lived in was only about a half a block away at 3624 South King Drive. For those of you who know Chicago, the housing community was built on 37th and King Drive, so literally just a half a block away, and it went to 39th Street and then all the way to Cottage Grove. And when it was built, it was a huge honor. It was a step up for most of the people who just ended up living there from what were kitchenettes. Okay. What happened in Bronzeville with the Great Migration, I think we might have mentioned that in the film. Mm-hmm. Because of restrictive covenants and redlining that took place in many cities, redlining was the banks that basically drew sort of red boundaries on maps of like, okay, we're not going to provide mortgages for people outside of this red line for people who are African American. So it made it very, very difficult for people to buy homes outside of certain areas. And then restrictive covenants were basically agreements that people made in different neighborhoods to not sell to African Americans. It was like peer pressure kind of thing, So for that reason, Bronzeville, the neighborhood, became super overcrowded with, with Southern migrants who couldn't move outside of those boundaries. And so the housing community was built in order to have concentrated housing instead of expanding the boundaries that people could live in. So in a way, it was a little cynical on the part of the city, to make that decision. But for people who lived in that neighborhood, moving into the Ida B. Wells homes was a step up because they were coming from kitchenettes that, I don't know if you know about kitchenettes, but they were like apartments that, just say for instance, had been built for, maybe a family of 4. They were sort of subdivided into smaller places so that instead of one family living where a family of 4 was supposed to live, you have 3 families that have a family of 4. And so it was just very, very crowded. And so people moved from those environments to the Ida B. Wells homes. And they had a lot of facilities that weren't available in the kitchenettes. So when it was first built, it was a joy. It was an honor to live in the Ida B. Wells homes. Now, they were named after her based on community engagement and activism within the community to name it after her. It was not the original name, and I can't remember what it was originally supposed to be called, but the people in Bronzeville decided we wanted to be named after her. But it was built in 1941, and as things continued in our country's history, our city's history, I think it was around the 1970s or so, there were some additional units that were added that were more high-rise, and then Chicago Housing Authority changed the rules on what the requirements were for people to live there, and so it started to fall into disrepair, and a lot of things that too many people, I find, want to associate with the African American experience, and so it just her name started to be associated with what was happening in the Ida B. Wells homes. Like I would, ask people, like, have you ever heard of Ida B. Wells? And they're like, the homes, yeah, the Ida B. Wells homes. And so they didn't even know who she was. They just remember, they were like the Ida B. Wells homes. And so it's like our family started feeling like, well, nobody even knows who Ida is. They just think she's a community, like a housing project.
A building.
So that was one of the things that when the homes when the decision was made to tear the homes down, my father and one of my uncles and I were sitting around, not around a campfire, we were sitting around the kitchen table. And we were like, we can't let the city of Chicago let Ida's name just drift away. And so what can we do? And so I was tasked with contacting the mayor, Mayor Richard M. Daley at the time. This was in 2008. To ask him, so you all decided to tear down the home, so what are you going to do? And so I actually was invited, along with my father, to join a committee that had already been formed as a result of the former residents of the Ida B. Wells homes. They are the ones that requested that something be done to honor her. And so for me, that kind of felt like kind of full circle because, the homes were named after her because of community involvement and activism, and then it was initiated by the residents of the homes to have something honor her. And so I joined this committee in 2008, and we finally we decided to have a monument created, and that was installed in 2021. So it only took 13 years to get this done. It was my first public artwork project I had ever worked on, and I didn't know what I was getting myself into. It's very, very complicated. I thought it was going to be easy. Sometimes you wonder, if you would have known going into it, what was going to be involved.
It's a good thing you didn't.
I didn't, total ignorance is a good thing sometimes, because then you kind of get into stuff not knowing what you're doing, and then you kind of can't get out of it because you want to see it finished. It was a long process.
But you got it done. And the Ida B. Wells Drive is the first drive or first road named after a Black American woman, correct?
It's the first major street in downtown Chicago named after any woman
After anyone.
or any person of color.
Okay, so it's a double.
Yeah, and you know, some people will say, well, what about this street, that street? I didn't say there was no street ever that existed on the, I said it's the first street in downtown Chicago named after any woman or any person of color. And that has pretty much stayed the same until DuSable Lakeshore Drive was changed to DuSable Lakeshore Drive, which it goes through downtown, still not in downtown. Yeah, so I was involved in helping to have the street name changed. It was, a lot of these things are very collaborative. It's not like Michelle, am just going around changing everything. There are committees, you know, involved, and a lot of times I'm on one person on the committee giving my input and giving my, you know, my perspective and information. But to have both the monument and the street name changed, there were a lot of people involved.
Yeah, okay. Next question. Is there another question? Keeps going. For Dan.
Hello, thank you for coming today. I'm wondering, granted, there's probably multiple people that this could apply to, but I'm wondering, who are some contemporary Black leaders that you believe are living into Ida B. Wells' legacy that we should be paying attention to?
I think I mentioned a few of them in the book. Stacey Abrams, when it comes to her, you know, her work around voting rights, to me, you know, she's doing a lot when it comes to that particular aspect of Ida's work. There's a woman named Latasha Brown who's doing the same thing. I only put like, I think 30 people in the book. And obviously there are more than 30 people in the country that are doing work that's sort of continuing the initiatives that she was involved in. I don't know, I can't think of any one person who's doing everything she did. She did an enormous amount of work in different aspects of our society. So, you know, there are people who are working on sort of voting rights and political engagement, which is one of the things that she did. You know, there are other people that are working in journalism who are doing great work when it comes to in-depth kind of reporting and exposing, you know, just truths. There's a woman named Wendy Thomas in Memphis. She started MLK 50 a couple of years ago in, I guess it had to be 2018. It was in honor of the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. And so it was supposed to be a one-year sort of tribute to that, you know, but she's grown it a lot. Everything's online now, so her name is Wendy Thomas, Wendi Thomas. She's doing an amazing amount of work when it comes to literally like deep dive kind of investigative journalism. There's a guy named Ashton Pittman who is with Mississippi Free Press. I follow him on Twitter. I've never met him before, but he does exhaustive journalism into sort of scandalous type of things. He's a really, really good reporter. So there's some people that I follow that I'm like, oh my God, you guys are like amazing when it comes to the journalism. And then, you know, she was a housing advocate. She was a teacher. I mean, there were so many things that she did. So when it comes to education, you know, activism and policy, I mean, there are people that are working in those fields. So I could just go on and on, I mean, because she was so multifaceted.
that's one of the questions that came from one of our small groups was, and you may not know anything about this, but she must have had incredible time management skills to have been able to do all, is there any family lore about that, or did you discover anything in your research about how she managed to do all the things she did?
And have 4 children.
Yeah. No.
Because
There was no family lore on how she managed her time.
we all want to know how we can do that better. so-
I want to know too, because I'm like super crazy busy and I don't have any kids. I don't even know how, I just can't even imagine.
Her husband, though,
Yeah.
did a lot for her, providing a nanny, and as I read the book, it
Yeah.
sounded like he was a super supportive husband, that the kind that you don't normally read about back then.
Exactly, yeah, or now.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are that many men today who, who are
Shifting
as
gears.
amazing. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how she, juggled all her time and managed all her time, but what I do know is that she, as Marianne mentioned, had my great-grandfather, Ferdinand Barnett, who clearly, everything that I ever learned about him was that he was very okay with her being her. He knew when he met her that she was super busy. She was extremely well known. I think she was one of the most famous women in the country at the time that he met her. And that didn't deter him from pursuing her. So he wanted to be with somebody who was a dynamo, activist kind of person, because everything that I heard about him was that, he was a widower. And so he had gone several years, after his first wife passed away, with every woman under the sun, like, oh my God, I'll be Mrs. Barnett. Because he was kind of a catch, he was an attorney. He owned the Conservator newspaper. He was a good-looking guy. So from what I understand, he had a lot of people who were really wanting to be with him, but he was like, I'm going to wait for somebody that I think is special. And so what I did grow up hearing was that Ferdinand was attracted to and wanted to be with a strong woman who, had her own mind, had her own identity. That's what he was looking for. And so she was perfect for him. And he was perfect for her because he wasn't trying to compete with her. He wasn't trying to make her smaller. He was okay with her hyphenating her name. Just all of the things that, even if you don't know anything about him, but just what she did after she got married, you can kind of guess, like, what he must have been like. I did learn that he was the main cook in the family. People ask me all the time, like, was there anything that you learned? I'm like, yeah, she didn't like to cook at all. And she was she wasn't like a fan of cleaning. She was kind of busy, so, so he worked with her. It's like, okay, well, you don't have to do that. We can hire somebody to do that. He did have the resources they had the resources to be able to do that. And from what I understand, not to be exploitative, but during that period of time, there was a mass migration from the south to the north, and people were clamoring for work. And so I guess it wasn't really that hard to find somebody that would be willing to come in and help. He did hire nurses for her. She traveled with infants, and he was like, okay, you go ahead and do your thing. Here's a nurse to go with you. So they did have the financial means to do that, and he was okay with her going off. She would be gone for months at a time. Like one time when she went to Washington, D.C., when she went to hang out with President McKinley, she had, her infant son with him, because it was in 1898. Her son was born in 1896, so she had a toddler and an infant. And she was gone for like 2 months. So what kind of man is like, yeah, you just go ahead and hang out with the president, for 2 months while I take care of the other kids. He, to me, I think his story is undertold, and that's one of the things there's only so much I can do, but I'm trying to get other people to write about Ferdinand, because he's always like Ida's husband. If you Google Ferdinand Barnett, it's like Ida's husband. And I'm like, no, he actually, in and of himself, was a really fascinating person. So,
Well, there's the expression, behind every great man, there's a great woman, but this is the reverse.
yeah.
Behind every great woman, there was the great husband kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And from what my grandmother said, and my grandmother did do some oral history. So I knew my grandmother, but also, how many of you, when you're 7 years old, sit and ask your grandmother, "Tell me all about your mother"? And I'm just going to sit here and listen to this. You're 7, you know? So you're not going to think of the same questions when you're 7 that you do when you're 37, you know? So there's a lot of things I did not ask my grandmother because I wanted to just hang out with my friends and ride my bike. But luckily, my grandmother, Alfreda, did some oral history projects, and so there are audio interviews of my grandmother, and so I was able to listen to those as an adult, and she did answer questions that I didn't have the chance to ask her. She died when I was in college. So if I would have known her, even if she would have lived until I was maybe 30 years old, I would have had the opportunity to ask her some more in-depth kind of questions, but I didn't think of those kind of things when I was 12, 13 years old. But, you know, she mentioned that her father, she learned how to cook from her father.
What might our church members do to contribute to her legacy? We're looking here, this is a predominantly white congregation, but we are also a congregation that's all about social justice and trying to make a difference. So what are some things that you think we might do in order to further what Ida B. Wells would like us to do? It's a tough one.
Wow. I don't really know off the top of my head, but I think hopefully we all agree that what's going on in our country right now, especially in certain states, is a little scary when it comes to efforts to erase or completely fictionalize our history. So, you know, I think supporting libraries, supporting teachers to tell the truth, be able to have the freedom to tell the truth to their students. We all need to register everybody to vote. You know, I was talking to some third graders the other day, and I was like, just promise me, the minute you turn 18, you're going to register to vote, because you know, people fought too hard and for too long to gain the right to vote, for people to not take advantage of it. We do have a foundation, Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation, so if you want to support that, that's always helpful, because we give scholarships to students at Ida's alma mater, Russ College, which is an HBCU. Most of the students are first generation college, so you're changing a whole family. I read a statistic the other day that when one person goes to college, it changes the trajectory of their entire family, because most of the time their children end up going to college, and so you change people generationally by even having one person go to college. So that's one thing, if as a congregation, if you wanted to do. I had thought about bringing the, I have flyers about the foundation and walked out of the house without them, but it's Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation. You can just Google that, it's easy to find. And yeah, vote, you know, and we need to vote for, like, as some people say, as our lives depend on it, because they kind of do. I feel like my great-grandmother lived through Reconstruction and then post-Reconstruction, where a lot of the rights that were gained during Reconstruction were rolled back. I feel like I'm living through the same thing. I feel like I'm living through post-civil rights, or some people call it the third Reconstruction or whatever, but I just can't believe that in 2023, we are living through seeing dismantlization, I'm going to make up a word, of so many gains that generations fought for. It's kind of heartbreaking, and I try to not be depressed about it, but it's a lot, you know, and I think we all have to stay vigilant and engaged and not get discouraged, and, you know, just do what we can to fight for the political leaders to do the right thing.
To do the right thing. That's the bottom line, is to do, and Ida B certainly did the right thing over and over, no matter what happened to her. That was amazing how she kept rising from one adversity to another. So,
Can I just mention too, for some people know this, Rust College is historically one of the United Methodist supported colleges in Holly Springs, Mississippi.
So I would like to thank you for coming and for your questions, and this has been very enlightening, and I hope those of you who have not read the book, that you get a chance to read it, and to check out the Ida B. Wells documentary on YouTube. There were quite a few things about Ida B. on YouTube. I could not find the American Experience, but that's okay.
No, it's not on YouTube. No, so there are 3 documentary films that have been made about Ida. One is Ida B. Wells, A Passion for Justice, which was made in 1988. It came out in 1989 as part of the American Experience series. William Greaves was the filmmaker. It was the first film made about Ida, based on her autobiography. And I actually had a chance to work on the film with him, with William Greaves. And William Greaves himself was a trailblazer. It was an amazing experience for me to be able to work with him. I worked as basically a production assistant. I was in film school at the time. I was really young, and so I was just kind of like carrying equipment and labeling, back in the day when there was film, labeling, you know, the bins and all that. I was doing like a lot of that kind of stuff. But that film is not available on YouTube. It's through the California Newsreel, and then even if you look at williamgreaves.com, you can order it through his website. Then the second film that was made about Ida was through WTTW, Chicago Stories. That is available for free on YouTube. But the films are very different. Bill Greaves' film is kind of Ida's whole life arc, which is a lot to put into 1 hour, but it does go through her whole life arc. The Chicago Stories is more focused on Chicago, on the years that she spent in Chicago, and it goes into a lot more detail about all of the work that Ida did in the city of Chicago. So it has more detail when it comes to that. And then there's a third film that was made that I don't know if it hasn't been released necessarily for wide distribution, but it's called Facing Down Storms, which was made by the University of Memphis. And that is focused on her Memphis years. So I mean, even though they're 3 different films, they're kind of different from each other. So I don't know if you looked up Facing Down Storms, you might be able to find like the trailer of it or something. But it's a process getting films into distribution, to widestream distribution.
Okay. So thank you very much. This is
Question.
One more question.
One question.
Yes.
Several people have asked me if you might sign their book.
Oh yes.
Oh yeah, sure.
Is it? Okay, that's awesome.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. Those of you who are watching online, thank you for watching online.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for inviting me.